Welcome to Joe Skeaping.
If you're feeling peckish, refreshments are available. Meat pies, meat and tater pies, steak and kidney pies, cheese and onion pies, peas on the saucer, cheese rolls, ham rolls, egg rolls, chicken rolls, salad rolls, sausage rolls, casseroles, rissoles, arsehole at the back of the club.
Has anyone seen that show?
Yeah.
Tell me, anyone know the name? Wheel Tappers and Shunters Social Club. So 1970s, the kind of heyday of the topic that I'm going to be talking about today. Thank you very much. The Working Men's Club. When I was researching this topic, actually, one of the things I enjoyed doing most was just looking at the photos. And I actually part of me just thought I could just do this talk by just showing these incredible photos. And it's, I'm a history teacher, that's my job, and I think really what is history teaching, or if you're interested in history, what you really like, what you're really interested in, is lost worlds, worlds that have vanished. And I know, of course, that working men's clubs still exist, and indeed there's one in Eastbourne, which I visited quite recently. But the heyday, the kind of dominance of the working men's club as a form of particularly male, but not only male, sociability, is one that is confined to the past. And in some ways, we might think, some people might say it's better off there, right? If you look at that first great little clip there, you've got all the kind of stereotypical features of the working men's club. You've got the dodgy food, you've got dodgy entertainment, you've got this kind of very officious chairman. I guess the purpose of my talk really is to try and sort of rescue the working men's club from some of those cliches and stereotypes. And I think the way I'm going to do that is to ask, okay, well, where did they come from? Why do they exist in the first place? Why do they emerge? So I'm actually not going to really talk about any of the things you can see on the slide here, unfortunately, or fortunately maybe. I'm not going to talk about how women come to play an increasing role in working men's clubs, which they do. And there's some really interesting kind of struggle that goes on for women to get more of a role. There's amazing kind of clubs that exist, like the Batley Variety Club, some of you may have heard of, played by people like Tom Jones and Shirley Bassey, and other kind of great clubs in the north of England in particular. And of course there are people like Bernard Manning, who's obviously strongly associated with the world of the working men's club. I'm definitely not going to be trying to redeem Bernard Manning's reputation. He's probably going to remain cancelled, even in the aftermath of this talk. Personally kind of into the cancelling, but hey. So I want to focus more, as I say, on the kind of early days, the emergence of these. And I really, when I was researching this book, by the way, is great, and this is the thing I would recommend if you want to find out more about the topic. So this is Clubland by Pete Brown. I think it was serialised on the radio a few years ago, so some of you might have come across it. And he says this in the introduction to his book: "Nostalgia is the junk food of history. We look back to find comfort in the warm glow of a past that never really existed." And he says, that's not the intention of him when he's writing this book, but it's sort of, that was how he was seen when he was kind of taking his book around to different publishers. He was told a history of working men's clubs is by definition not proper history. And I suppose one purpose of my talk today is to try and convince you that it is proper history, that we can learn about really important aspects of the lives of working class people through history, through looking at things like working men's clubs. So, to get there, would that be in 1 second, if that's all right. I need to sort of now make you all uncomfortable again, because obviously we're all British, and so talking about class is kind of awkward. So in order to make us all feel better, let's watch a little clip of a politician trying to answer the question, who are the working class? And this is really painful for me to watch. I've watched it several times now, so apologies to you in advance. I wonder if anyone knows what the clip is going to be. Some of you might have seen it. It's not so long ago that it's on our screens.
Define working class.
Working class is families that work for their living, earn their money through going out to work every day.
Don't middle classes do that?
Well, working class families have the ordinary hope to get on in life. I mean, this has been a
Don't middle
story.
classes have that
Yeah,
as
of
well?
course they do. Of course they do.
So what's
But
the distinction?
people will say to me, "Well, look here, you've come a long way.
Yeah, you went to state school.
Yeah, but that is the ordinary hope of the working class, which is to have a decent education, to get a decent secure job, to get a car, to get have a nice holiday, to have a
Isn't that
house."
the middle class too, Sir Keir? Everything you just listed? No? Tell me.
It is, yeah, it is, and that's why many people go on their life journey from what you might call working class to middle class.
Describe yourself.
Don't take it anymore. Don't take it again. Why is it so uncomfortable? Why does he have such a difficult job here? Anyone,
There's no whole idea of working class in.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it, if I was going to try and be fair to Sir Keir, who's not, necessarily the world's most charismatic politician, but if I was to be fair to him, I think, our kind of like relationship to class now, here are all the different ways in which we might think about class, right? We've got all of these different associations with class. So, what politicians, of course, want to do is to try and speak to as many people as possible. So class is actually quite an uncomfortable subject. They'd rather avoid it if at all possible. They don't really want to sort of divide people on those lines. And also, we don't really even quite know what we're talking about when we talk about class anyway. So I sort of think actually a more useful way to think about this is, well, where does the working class kind of emerge from? Because we tend to think of working class or these categories as just like being eternal and universal, but I don't think they are actually. I think they come in like a very specific historical context, right? And there are basically two kind of reasons for the emergence of the working class, like the urban industrial working class. So the first is enclosures, right? I'm not going to spend a long time lecturing you about the history of enclosures, because, you've probably all got better things to do with your lives, but they are important, right? These are these moments where you have like ordinary kind of labourers, agricultural labourers, who find that their landowners are basically seizing the land that they farmed for generations, taking it into private ownership, fencing it off, and this means that rather than being able to work the land as they have historically done, they're going to be forced into the cities to try and find work. And of course, at the same time, you then have an ongoing industrial revolution, you have a mechanisation of work. And if you just think about like what's happening to working class people here in this process, they're going from a world where they work outside, where they might work in quite a communal way. They might sort of like, they might sing, they might sort of entertain each other. The work is seasonal, so it will change depending on like the length of the light in the day and so on. And you go into an indoor, very disciplined environment where you're not really allowed to talk, where you're doing a very boring, mechanistic, repetitive task. And so your life becomes much harder, it's much, there's just much more drudgery, it's much more kind of routinized, and it's much more disciplined. And so, what are working class people looking for in this kind of new environment? Well, they're looking for like outlets, right, to be able to kind of, enjoy themselves, to give themselves a break. Mm-hmm. But of course, every time they try and do this in the 19th century, what they find is Victorian social elites keep telling them off for all the different things they like doing. So the classic example here is this is the gin palace, right? So that you get pubs, of course, in the 19th century. Working class people take the kind of entertainments that they've enjoyed in the fields and they bring them into the pubs and singing and so on. You have these amazing things like judge and jury clubs. I don't know if anyone's heard of these, but basically these are sort of like, they would just do like mock trials. They would stage like mock trials of individual members of the club who would, like worn their hat indoors or whatever. And there's these amazing comments. So like J. Ewing Ritchie, who is a kind of middle class social commentator, says, of a judge and jury club, I solemnly believe that in Sodom and Gomorrah, nothing more filthy could have been talked about, and that this side of pandemonium, there is nothing more debasing or debased, right? So this is like these kind of crazy moral panics that exist in Victorian England around kind of the things that working class people like doing. And this kind of disciplining of working class people is also reflected in what's happening with the creation of the police. So you have the Metropolitan Police created in 1829. This photo I love, this image, this woodcut I love, because it says Chartist riots, right? Now, some of you might know the Chartists, a sort of working class political organisation in the 1840s. The Chartists have just had a meeting, and the Metropolitan Police, I'm not going to make any kind of modern links here, right? But the Metropolitan Police have shown up with their staves and are just battering, right, these guys who stood in, and who goes to prison in the aftermath of this? I'll give you a clue, right? It's not the members of the Metropolitan Police. So this kind of hemming in, I guess, of the working class is for me, it's really important in this story. And here are various other ways this happens. Bartholomew Fair, very famous, kind of fair that's existed in London since the Middle Ages. It's closed down in the middle of the 19th century. It seems like, a place of sin, of prostitution, of kind of like, thieving and so on. All kinds of different working class entertainments. I've made a sort of rough list here. Fairgrounds, dog and pigeon racing, street football, pitch and toss, street racing, wrestling, travelling street performances. All of these kinds of things are written off as vagrancy and so on. So, too many pieces of paper. So, what do you do? Well, the way in which now this is being sort of represented back to working class people is, look, you need to aim for this kind of middle class respectability, which gives you kind of buy-in to, be treated with a greater degree of respect from society. And the kind of key preacher of this is a guy called Samuel Smiles, who some of you might have heard of, who writes this very famous book called Self-Help. And this is the kind of Bible of Victorian liberalism. And he famously says, God helps those who help themselves. So what elites are kind of preaching to working class people is this doctrine of self-reliance as the route to respectability. And this amazing quote in the Times, which comes from around about the same time, mid-19th century, Samuel Smiles, I love this. We are all striving to take him by the hand and do him some good or other. We build institutions for him. We present him with books and pictures and models. We read to him and we preach to him. So this is obviously talking about the working class. And everything you need to know about attitudes of elites towards the working class in the 19th century is here in this text. That kind of us and them, this distinction, the infantilization of the working class. These are just children. They don't understand anything. They don't produce any culture. We produce all this remarkable culture and we sort of give it to them and they don't appreciate it and understand it. And so the question I guess we've sort of run into here is, well, can working class people find a way to develop their own forms of sociability that they enjoy, or are they just going to be sort of like given the culture of elites, without having any real say in it? And I think this is where the club comes in. So before I go on to just talk a bit more about working men's clubs, can I just ask, is anyone here like a member of a working men's club? I'm going to see if I can't quite see. Okay, maybe like half a hand. Has it? Can you? Okay, let's ask a gentler question. Has anyone been in a working men's club? Yeah, like more people. Okay, keep your hand up if you've been in a working men's club in the last 5 years. Yeah, less. Right. So the story that we tend to focus on, if you think about the press and so on, when it comes to working men's clubs, is like a story of decline, right? These are institutions that are in sort of long-term terminal decline. The high point in the 1970s, there are 4,000. There's now less than about 1,000. And they're much smaller as well. But I guess I think it's interesting just to flip it over and look at the story of the rise. So of course, the original clubs that we're familiar with in London, let's say in the 18th, 19th centuries, the Gentlemen's Club. And there's various of these that spring up. They actually emerge from the coffee house culture of the 18th century. Coffee houses, anyone can go into a coffee house. The reason you get the emergence of these gentlemen's clubs is to keep the working class out, right? And if you think about what class is, that's how class is defined, right? Who can come in and who can't come in. That's a kind of basic definition of how class works. So working class people respond by creating their own clubs. And these are initially political clubs. The most famous example would be the London Corresponding Society from the 1790s, which has this radical principle. Our membership is unlimited. It terrifies the government of the time. It suggests a kind of potentially uncontrollable movement. And then there are various other kind of political clubs that appear over the course of the next 50 or so years. But of course, none of these political clubs actually meet a core demand of working class people for sociability. They're much more focused on achieving certain political goals. And at the same time, when you get the rise of Chartism and other radical political movements, Victorian elites are looking at this and saying, well, we need to find some kind of safety valve, some kind of way of reducing the social pressure that emerges from the very harsh conditions of industrial life. And the various things are tried and fail. And really, this guy, Henry Solly, I'm not going to actually read all of this, obviously, but Henry Solly is really the kind of key architect of the Working Men's Club. So who is Henry Solly? He's a guy who's been involved with Chartism. He's been a Christian socialist. He keeps getting kicked out of every single office that he holds in the church because he keeps saying kind of radical things that he's not supposed to say. And he ends up, as William Beveridge describes him, he's a restless spirit. He's constantly moving from like one kind of hobby horse to another, and he finally lands on working men's clubs as this institution that will do all the kinds of things that he thinks working class people need. And what he realises, which lots of other people in the middle class particularly don't understand, is that if you want to give working class people this kind of like better form of culture, you need to also provide them with spaces that they want to be in. And that particular quote there at the top there, none of the things that have been tried meet undoubtedly the first great want of working men after their long day's toil: unrestrained social intercourse, the means of chatting with one another. So that's basically what the need that working men's clubs are going to meet. So he sets up in 1862 this organisation called the Club and Institute Union. Now it actually comes out to some extent of initiatives that are happening in places like Brighton. Another significant figure there is what's his name? Too many notes, I'm afraid. It's in there somewhere. Frederick Robertson, the nonconformist preacher in Brighton. So he's, there are several people doing these kinds of initiatives in the 1840s, but nobody's putting it together in the way that Solly does. But of course, Solly immediately realises he needs to raise money. And so to do that, of course, he has to go to wealthy patrons. And this really provides the first kind of big problem of this movement, which is it's been set up for working class people to enjoy each other's company, but it's being paid for by elites who really want to try and sort of civilise the working class. So you've got these two kind of objectives that are clashing with one another. And the big area where this comes to fruition, this clash, is over beer. Because the question is beer a kind of civilizing force? You know, it's something that enables this kind of like easy chat between individuals, or is it something that makes us all kind of wild and anarchic? And obviously, working class people, you know, a lot of them would have drunk beer during the working day, right? You would have had like enlightened employers would have just allowed working class people to do this. So Solly initially is very hostile to the idea because he thinks it goes against his principle of rational recreation. Go to the title of my talk. This is what he sees as the goal of the Working Men's Club. But he's basically forced to back down. There's a simple reason for this. The clubs are not viable. That his vision of a kind of network of successful working men's clubs won't work if they're dry. And so, with the greatest reluctance, we're told Solly backs down. And very quickly then, these clubs become much more viable, and they particularly benefit, we'll come to Reddish in a minute, they particularly benefit from the licensing laws of 1872. Now lots of you will be familiar with the licensing laws. They continue to shape our lives today. It's still the case, obviously, I think I'm right in saying, that last orders are called at 11 o'clock in everywhere outside of London, which at least in 1872 places could stay up until 12. It also stipulates that every person who is drunk while in charge on any highway or other public place with any carriage, horse, cattle, or steam engine, or who is drunk when in possession of any loaded firearms. So just in case it does get out of hand this evening, a reminder there, that stuff is all still on the statute book, I'm assured. So they introduce these licensing laws, but the crucial thing is they don't apply to working men's clubs, because working men's clubs are private institutions. They are member-subscribed institutions, right? So the government say, well, of course it does, because, well, working class people drink there, so it must do. But the response is, well, it doesn't apply to the gentlemen's clubs in Mayfair and Pall Mall, so in Park Lane and so on, so it can't apply to us. And there's kind of no legal response to this, right? You've also got working class people going and like smashing up some of these gentlemen's clubs when the laws are first introduced, which adds a little bit of pressure to the situation. So the story ends happily. Clubs really benefit from the licensing laws and the changes introduced. They also benefit from another really key change that then follows, which is through pressure within the working men's club movement, the whole thing is democratised. And this is something I think people do not really appreciate about working men's clubs. The working men's clubs start as basically institutions that are controlled by wealthy patrons and that have been set up to sort of like improve and make respectable the working class. But in order to basically survive, that model has to change. They basically become member-owned, member-led, fully democratic. The whole movement is democratic in the way that people who had been, for example, Chartists or who had been trade unionists would have been very familiar with. So working class people get control over these institutions, this so-called revolt against patronage. The earliest still surviving is here. This is Riddish, which is near Stockport. What I like about this image, amongst other things, is just how like defiantly unglamorous it is. This is the oldest working men's club in Britain, right? And you look at it, there's absolutely nothing here that gives you any indication that this might be in any way historically important or significant. And I think that that encapsulates something to me about the working men's club movement. There's something like deeply unpretentious and sort of like unself-aggrandizing about this world. But I think it's like hugely important, and the scale of it is, I think, really mind-blowing. So you go from about 300 clubs in 1887 to over 2,000 clubs by 1922, over 1 million members. Places like Huddersfield, 70 working men's clubs in Huddersfield in the heyday in the 1970s, just within that one town. So I'm really going to, there's so much I could talk about here, and obviously the sort of, I suspect if I starting a talk on working men's clubs, I'm sure lots of you expecting me to talk about, well, particularly this, Bernard Manning really, and then sort of like variations around that. But I just wanted to try and look at it from the other end. I think I'm going to sort of say they do 3 core things, I think, for working class life. I'm going to say what those are, and then I'm going to wrap up. So the first thing is they bring together a whole load of like different strands of political activism. You get actually liberal and conservative working men's clubs. Some of you will be familiar. Some places like the Constitutional Club, there's one in Lewes, there's one in Crowborough. Those are all actually originally conservative clubs. You have liberal clubs, and you also have radical clubs. This is the famous Mildmay Radical Club in London. And out of this kind of organisation, you get stimulation of the trade union movement and this kind of feeding into the organisation of the Labour Party in 1900. So I think that's really one aspect, but I don't think it's the most important aspect, actually. I think what's much more important in terms of the legacy of the working men's clubs is this kind of social milieu that is created in working class communities. So organisers within the working men's club movement become MPs, they become magistrates, they become town councillors, they become district councillors. They provide days out. They provide Christmas dinners for the elderly, they provide convalescent homes, they provide summer schools. There are 12 scholarships to Ruskin College, Oxford, provided by the working men's club movement in the 20th century every year. Obviously reading rooms, there are like cheap housing available for retired workers, hardship funds, marriages, wakes take place within working men's clubs. But more than that, of course, they're kind of just like informal cooperative society. So there are places you can go to get advice, to get financial support, somebody who can like help you with a problem in your house or with your family. So they're this vital kind of centre for social interaction and social support. And then of course, and we've got a few images, they're again just like great images that I could just look at these for ages, to be honest. And this one as well. I love, and again, you talk about the unpretentiousness, like the decor. It's just they're a particular world. And I've been to lots of working men's clubs over the past few months, all around Sussex, and it's such a familiar setup. Like everywhere you go, and what you see is sort of like trophy cabinets, pictures of like successes of the or like past events of the club, the names of the presidents, but all of this sort of like very like familiar decor in each one. But of course, like at the root of all of that is the idea of identity. It's the idea of belonging to something. And I guess there's loads of stuff I could talk lots about the kind of music hall entertainment side of it. I'm actually just going to pause there because I think the identity thing is so important. In this period now, we live in a world, I think, where, and I've tried to illustrate this at the start of the talk, our sense of identity is very fragmented. We feel much less of a sense of I belong to this class, I belong to this community. We live in one community, we work somewhere else. We don't know our neighbours as well. And it seems to me that working men's clubs are representative of an age in which socialisation within your community was much more important. And I don't have an answer to how do you rebuild those kinds of social bonds, because I think you see in our politics at the moment and perhaps in society more generally what the potential dangers are as society just becomes more and more detached and atomised. And I guess if I was going to try and just like curry a bit of favour with Tim to finish, I'd probably say that things like this are quite good examples of how you can do sort of like these, a bit of relaxed. What was my title? My rational recreation. Right. This is a kind of rational recreation, and so on that basis, I will finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.